Grandfather, born in 1904, was an oysterman on Virginia's Chesapeake Bay. And he instilled in every one of his children and his grandchildren the importance of the vote. Yes, I'm an actor, but also more importantly, an American, a citizen, a voter. And I'm about to tell you a scary story about how the core tenet of our democracy, one person, one vote, is under attack. Today, American citizens are being wrongly purged from voter rolls, others intimidated not to vote. Meanwhile, state after state has passed new voter restriction laws, making it harder for all of us to vote. How did this happen? And what's the justification for this takedown of America's democracy? Well, this scary story starts in Chicago on a mild November night. The year's 2008.
All right, let's do this thing. Everybody ready?
Ladies and gentlemen, the next First Family of the United States of America.
We have never been a collection of red states and blue states. We are and always will be the United States of America.
The election of Barack Obama most certainly can't be left out of this story. That absolutely was a turning point.
If there is anyone out there who still questions the power of our democracy, tonight is your answer.
That election was such a big moment. It seemed there was this demographic tide and destiny had kind of taken over for Democrats, and that, we were going to see Democratic majorities and presidents into the foreseeable future.
Because of what we did on this day, in this election, change has come to America.
Barack Obama, he said, I'm going to turn red states blue. He said, I will compete in Florida. I'm going to compete here in the South, Virginia and North Carolina. I will have the audacity to challenge the Republican Foundation in Ohio and Indiana. And guess what? The Latino population is growing out here. It is the future of the Democratic Party. I will not only contest for it, I will win it.
Whites in this country have voted Republican in every election since 1968. And for at least since 2000, all of the major minority groups, blacks, Hispanics, Asians, have voted Democratic.
The data is very, very clear here. If you are losing the vast majority of Hispanic voters, and if Hispanic voters are the fastest growing demographic in your country, and you can't appeal to them, you lose. This is very simple. You lose.
The 2008 election was the first election in which people of color were over a quarter of the eligible electorate. African Americans turned out at record numbers.
This is an historic election, and I recognize the special significance it has for African Americans and for the special pride that must be theirs tonight.
We did start seeing some major backlashes against the expansion of the rights to vote after President Obama came into power. I think it has to do with changing demographics, with people having anxiety over the browning of America.
2008 was the beginning of the whole demographic tide, the first election where we could see the demographics impacting. And if we continue to underperform in this multiracial world that is going to be America, the white voters are going to be a clear minority, the Republican Party will cease to exist.
The future looked pretty daunting for Republicans at that time, and so there were those like me who said, we just have to do a better job of being compassionate conservatives, of expanding our ranks. But there were others that took a route where we kind of go down the road of figuring out how you turn out more of your people and less of the other guys.
The road many Republican leaders chose amounts to what we'll call the voter suppression playbook. Since 2010, they've created a number of plays or strategies to counter the rising demographic tide of non-white voters and to discourage younger voters. The first play was codenamed Project Red Map.
The concept was to leverage true national dollars from national donors on the Republican side and invest them in state races, state legislative races, in a way that had never been done before.
In 2010, Red Map sought to change almost 20 legislative bodies to Republican control. To fund that, Chris Jankowski and the Republican State Leadership Committee recruited the Kochs, the billionaire brothers with their own political action group, Americans for Prosperity.
There are about 400 very wealthy individuals now who are allied with Charles and David Koch in a kind of a rich people's political movement.
I'm Mary Stack, the director of Cambridge Forum, and tonight we are going to hear about the secret history of Koch Industries and their insidious infiltration into multiple areas of American life. Worth over $120 billion, Koch is one of the largest private companies in the world today. You may not think you support their financial interests, but Koch's vast, sprawling conglomerate undergirds every aspect of modern American life. Koch controls the nitrogen fertilizer that grows your food, the gas that powers your car, the fibers in your clothes, the building material in your home, and the microchips that drive your life online. But it is the stuff you cannot see that is the most troubling. Koch has one of the biggest, most lavishly funded lobbying operations in the country. And the DNA of the Koch ideology raises the whole question of the role of government in the 21st century. Tonight, I'm delighted to welcome the writer who spent 7 years of his life researching the Koch view of the world, Chris Leonard.
So, Koch Industries, Kochland, why do this book? Why would I spend so much time thinking about one company that's privately held, that doesn't get a lot of attention because it doesn't have publicly traded stock? It's never talked about on CNBC. It rarely gets attention. The only degree to which it does get attention is because of the political activities of its owners, David and Charles Koch. But the book, for me, really started with diving into the hidden corporate empire behind David and Charles Koch, the machine that gives them the fortune that they have used to redraw American politics, which is something I'm sure we're going to get to. But for me, the concerns really started on the business front. I'm a business reporter, okay? And so I'm looking for stories that help illuminate what's going on in the American economy and in the American political system. And I saw Koch as this perfect institution to help explain a couple things that were bothering me. The first is the structure of our economy. Okay, we're finishing a decade of economic growth, a decade of uninterrupted economic growth. The employment rate right now is the lowest it's been in 50 years. I think it's still in the 3% range, close to 4%. I mean, this is like 1960s era economic growth, but everybody knows it's not like the 1960s. We've had a decade of growth, and it is inarguable that most Americans haven't advanced economically during those 10 years of growth. You see it every day on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, you name it. Wages are stagnant. People are taking on debt to cover the rising costs of daily life, the rising complexity of daily life, whether it's dealing with health insurance bureaucracies, paying the mortgage. People are borrowing money to simply stay where they were 10 years ago. And when we face the next inevitable economic downturn, most of us will not have advanced past square one where we were in October 2009. The American economy hasn't always been that way. It hasn't always been that way. And we can talk about the economic history, but back in the 50s and 60s when the economy grew, the gains were broadly shared. And I wanted to know why. Why is that? Why can we grow, but the growth and the gains are captured by this tiny group of people, 400 families, one of them being the Kochs, whose wealth is simply astounding. I remember this one sentence in the book. In 2008, David Koch, his fortune was tiny compared to what it is now. And he passed away, as you know. But even then, it would have taken something, if you earned $300 an hour and you worked 365 days a year, you would have had to work thousands of years to earn how much money David Koch had at that time. And his wealth has grown since. Koch Industries is a great vehicle to start to explore why this is, okay? We just heard from Mary not just how big the company is, okay? This company is enormous. It's privately held, but its annual sales are bigger than that of Facebook, Goldman Sachs, and U.S. Steel combined. That's how big it is. And it's not just big, it's embedded in daily life. It specializes in the kinds of products you depend on every day that you couldn't boycott if you wanted to. Fertilizer, fuel, building materials, clothing materials, the sensors in your phone. Coke is playing in all of these spaces. So that means when you write about Coke, you can write about our energy infrastructure. You can write about blue-collar manufacturing jobs and middle-class workers who work at Coke's Georgia Pacific division that makes brawny paper towels, Dixie cups, building materials. You can look at labor unions and what they have meant for the American economy over the last 50 years and where they stand today. Spoiler, things aren't great. You know, labor unions are down to like 7% of all private sector workers, and I think it's one of the big reasons why people don't keep the gains of what they earn at work. By writing about Coke, you can talk about derivatives traders and this world of high finance. Coke operates one of the largest global networks of derivatives and commodities trading desks in the world. They don't brag about what they do, but what they do rivals anything on Wall Street, anything operated by JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs. Maybe most importantly, one of the things that really concern me that you can write about when you write about Coke is corporate lobbying. I firmly believe as a business reporter that corporations hold a place of power over our public life and our public policy that they haven't held in 100 years. Corporate power is at a level today that we haven't seen since the early 1900s, what we call the robber baron era, when life was remarkably similar to where it is today. I'm kind of obsessed with that era, and I read about it all the time, and the stories from the early 1900s are about corruption in Congress, workplace injuries, rampant environmental pollution, corruption in the White House, self-enrichment by politicians. None of this stuff is new, and I would like to point out that we solved these problems in the 1930s. We can leave that discussion, but it's not like this stuff is inevitable. Coke Industries, I think, plays an unrivaled role in corporate lobbying in Washington, D.C. Coke has built a corporate lobbying machine more powerful, I would say, than that of even like Lockheed Martin, Walmart, General Electric. Coke has one of the largest registered lobbying shops in the United States, but it also funds a constellation of think tanks and university chairs that sort of mainstream the Coke ideas. Then Coke has organized a donor network that can raise $800, $900 million during a campaign cycle. That's as much as a political party, the Democratic or Republican actual parties. Sometimes that's as much as they will raise. And finally, Coke has at its disposal a nationwide activist network called Americans for Prosperity, whereby it can get people knocking on doors in neighborhoods around the country, Ohio, West Virginia, Oregon, Nevada, you name it. Americans for Prosperity can have people canvass neighborhoods. It can fill up charter buses full of angry voters and deliver them to the doorstep of specifically targeted lawmakers in Washington, D.C. to press for Coke's case. I don't know of any lobbying machine in Washington that is this multifaceted, this widespread, and this well coordinated. Which raises the question, what are they trying to do? What do they lobby for? You know, what's at the root of their vision, the root of the vision for the corporation itself, and the root of the vision for this political machine? All of the political chapters in this book start the day after the election. And that's when all the attention, all the eyeballs start to drift to other stuff. And then the actual mind-numbingly boring business of governing starts to take place. And that's where Coke leverages its expertise. It is there every single day in the halls of Congress, in the courts, in the halls of the state legislatures, in the administrative agencies, EPA, OSHA. And so, I mean, one thing I want to say to people is, let's say you disagree with the Koch agenda, you need to stay engaged after the election and be on point when these important but obscure and highly boring governmental actions are taking place.
And David Koch has died. He was a billionaire businessman, one-time vice presidential nominee, and conservative megadonor. John Yang looks at his life and legacy.
David Koch helped his brother Charles expand the Wichita-based Koch Industries into one of the largest privately held corporations of the world. He quickly became a notable figure in elite New York social circles. The business eventually became the fuel behind one of the highest spending political action groups in modern American politics, Americans for Prosperity.
Americans for Prosperity is responsible for the content of this advertising.
The anti-tax pro-small government group poured hundreds of millions of dollars into conservative candidates and causes, often through untraceable so-called dark money contributions.
The president's doing a mediocre job.
The oil and gas-based Koch network spent just under $400 million on the 2012 election, an unparalleled sum at the time that filled the airwaves with attack ads.
Obama's health care law is actually one of the largest tax increases in history,
targeting President Obama and the Affordable Care Act while long denying climate change.
I'm basically a libertarian.
In a 2014 interview with ABC's Barbara Walters, Koch defended his political contributions.
Do you think it's fair that just because you have billions of dollars, you can influence elections?
Well, I contribute to Republican candidate campaigns, and there's a federal limit on how much you can contribute to each individual candidate. I obey the law in that regard and feel that I'm doing it properly.
Limits on corporate donations to political candidates had been lifted 4 years earlier, the result of the Citizens United Supreme Court battle that the brothers had helped fund. The Koch brothers famously did not endorse Donald Trump in 2016 over concerns about free trade, but their group did target several Democratic senators in the 2018 midterm elections. In addition to politics, Koch gave millions to cancer research, some PBS programs, and a full wing of the Smithsonian's Natural History Museum. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm John Yang.
They looked at the 2008 election as a catastrophe.
With some $30 million in funding, Red Map launched the blitzkrieg of attack ads targeting Democrats running for state legislatures.
Americans for Prosperity is responsible for the content of this advertising.
And the 2010 elections really showed that you couldn't compete with all this outside money flooding into these races that could carry the day. And in some of these races was over $200,000 in attack ad money that just flooded into a race that before had never seen more than $50,000 per candidate. And Operation Red Map was looking at what are the states that we need to win the state legislatures and take control of state politics. North Carolina was at the top of the list. North Carolina is the true battleground. Democrats have the edge in terms of voter registration, followed by Republicans, and then independents are the fastest growing group of the electorate.
In the summer of 1999, my children are almost out of the house, and I had always been in politics and other people's campaigns. My grandfather was Speaker of the House many, many years ago here in North Carolina, and I thought, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to run for the House, and I did, and I was elected. In these tough times, my priority is doing what I can to help families deal with rising costs.
Margaret Dixon, fighting for our priorities.
In 2010, North Carolina's Margaret Dixon sought re-election as a state senator. She ended up caught in Red Map's crosshairs.
I had not heard of the Red Map plan at that time. I did not see it coming, and I don't think any of my former colleagues saw it coming either.
Incumbent Senator Margaret Dixon. Who does she really care about using her public office to help companies she owned? Special deals, insider trading, no bid state contracts, all for her own gain.
The hooker ad portrayed me as a prostitute. So that was pretty shocking. When the ads came out, I had women come to me crying at the portrayal of a woman candidate in that light.
We took some artistic license. You can take a set of facts and then tell a story that fits your narrative.
And the Red Map narrative worked amazingly well.
Democrats across the nation took a big hit in yesterday's midterm elections, and the same thing is being felt right here in Indiana.
The state Republicans overtook the state House and the state Senate.
Well, there is a complete swing from a Democratic to a Republican majority.
We set a record for any political party in American history in the gain of state legislative seats. We gained over 700 seats in one election.
In the North Carolina Senate, on Election Day, the Senate was composed of 30 Democrats and 20 Republicans. The next day, it was 31 Republicans and 19 Democrats. The only word you can use for that is just tsunami.
We did what we needed to do in 2010, which was take dominant Republican control at the state level.
Red Map focused on the 2010 elections because in 2011, many state legislatures would redraw their voting districts based on the 2010 census, something that happens every 10 years. So partisan redistricting, also called gerrymandering, became the next play. And whoever gerrymanders usually wins.
Gerrymandering involves primarily two different methods of dealing with voters of the opposite party. You can pack voters into districts, or you can crack them into districts to make them ineffective.
Texas is as good an example of packing and cracking as anywhere in the country, particularly the Dallas-Fort Worth area. If you look at the map that was originally drawn and approved by the Republicans in 2011. Why would this district from the north that's controlled by Anglos up here in a suburban county, why would it come in to Tarrant County like this? It's because they came in and they picked up Latino voters. And you see that they just very carefully pick up this big group of Latino voters, then come back and pick up another group of Hispanic voters like that. This is a classic cracking of Latino voters. Cracking is taking the people of color and cracking them into as many districts as possible where their vote won't make a difference. Packing is putting as many African Americans or Hispanics into as few districts as possible. This shows District 30, which is this packed district. Well, to get a sense of how packed that district is, we're going to shade both African Americans and Hispanics together. So the black plus Hispanic population, then in purple, you start to see what's going on. You've got a district here that virtually doesn't have anything in it except purple. Classic way of undermining minority voting strength.
If you favor one side over the other, you can clearly take a right turn on Maple Street and a left turn on Mulberry Street and have a partisan impact. It's also an opportunity for the maximum mischief in the line drawing.
The Republicans were able to draw unbelievably precise districts that maximize partisan advantage, where you can have a state where the state is relatively even between the Democrats and the Republicans, and yet the Republicans may win 2/3 or 3/4 of the congressional districts. And that's what we're seeing as a result of the redistricting in many states in 2010. The party in power really decides who's going to stay in power. And that's not real democracy. And that's what we have in way too many states in our country right now.
People feel that their vote doesn't count. And gerrymandering makes sure that they feel like their vote doesn't count. Because what happens is you get pushed into a district that is completely safe for one party or the other. And if it's completely safe, why vote?
In 2018, Americans voted for who would represent them in Congress. But in North Carolina, the election results were really weird. These squares represent all the voters in North Carolina. They were voting for these 13 seats in Congress. About half voted for Republicans, and about 48% voted for Democrats. So you might think of the 13 congressional seats, maybe Democrats would have won 6 seats, and Republicans would have won 7. But no, Democrats only won 3 of 13 seats, way less than half. This imbalance was because North Carolina's congressional districts had been gerrymandered. It means that these voters had been grouped into districts very strategically with the goal of benefiting one party. Gerrymandering has pretty much always happened in America. That's because every 10 years, the political districts are redrawn. And in most cases, those new lines get drawn by whoever holds power in state government at the time. That's what happened in 2010. Republicans won control of lots of state governments and redrew the political lines to favor themselves. And over the next few years, redistricting helped them hold on to almost all those states. This shifted the balance of power. And it turns out behind a lot of this was one guy.
Usually the voters get to pick the politicians. In redistricting, the politicians get to pick the voters.
This is Thomas Hofeller, the mapmaker who helped Republicans gerrymander districts over the last decade. When Hofeller died in 2018, his daughter found thousands of his emails and files, which she shared with activists. The files show that Tom Hofeller's fingerprints are all over the way America's political maps look today. But North Carolina was his masterpiece. And if you want to understand why gerrymandering is such a big problem in the US, that's a good place to start. The basics of gerrymandering are actually pretty simple. If you're a Republican trying to keep power, you want to do 2 things. First, pack as many Democratic voters as possible into a single district. If you have a district where almost everyone votes Democrat, that means almost half these votes are basically wasted. You can also crack big Democratic areas into separate districts where there are slightly more Republicans. So even though an area has a lot of Democratic votes, they would actually lose in this district and in this district. These are the 2 elements of classic gerrymandering, packing and cracking. And Hofeller employed these techniques masterfully in North Carolina. In 2011, he was hired to redraw the state's political lines. And for congressional districts, he came up with this map. Now I just want to focus in on District 12, this weird skinny shape. In order to make sense of this shape, we have to look at another map. This map shows the percentage of black people in each neighborhood. The bluer areas are where more black people live. Hofeller basically gathered up black people in Winston-Salem, Greensboro, and Charlotte and packed them into one district. So that's how District 12 happened. Hofeller also did this with North Carolina state representatives and state senators. For example, here are the state senate districts. Here, he packed Winston-Salem into one district, and then packed Greensboro into its own district. These new districts help Republicans get a stranglehold on power in the North Carolina State House. And over the next few years, they were able to pass crucial legislation.
A strict new voter ID law in North Carolina.
Which bathrooms transgender individuals can use in North Carolina.
In 2016 and 2017, federal courts ruled that both of these maps were unconstitutional. They said what North Carolina Republicans did wasn't just gerrymandering, it was racial gerrymandering, done to deliberately dilute the political power of black people. The court said the Republicans in the North Carolina State House now had to redraw the lines without looking at racial demographics. So, they went back to Tom Hofeller. This time, Hofeller couldn't look at race. Instead, he looked at which areas voted for Democrats and which areas voted for Republicans. Instead of a racial gerrymander, it would be a partisan gerrymander. Here's that map, using data from 2014. The bluer an area, the more Democratic voters there are. Now, if you zoom in here to Greensboro, you can see one of the highest concentrations of Democratic voters in the state. Hofeller drew a congressional district line to crack this community in half. This meant Democrats here were now in the minority in their district, and Democrats here were also in the minority in their district. Hofeller employed these techniques all over the state to create North Carolina's new political districts. And the first big test for these new maps would be the 2018 election. Democrats were expected to turn out in droves.
Democrats are vying for a potential blue wave.
The wave that Republicans fear is going to wipe them out.
So, how did the maps do? For state representatives, Democrats got 51% of the vote. They only won 46% of seats. For state senate, they received half the vote and won just 42% of seats. And for Congress, you already know how that one turned out. Democrats won nearly half the votes, but won only 3 out of 13 seats. A year later in 2019, the Supreme Court weighed in. They said it was beyond their reach, that it wasn't their job to fix it. All of this raised an existential question. If Republicans could continue drawing the lines to stay in power, how could they ever be elected out of office? But the Supreme Court's ruling left open the possibility for state courts to rule on partisan gerrymandering. And in September 2019, that's exactly what North Carolina's Supreme Court did. The court found that partisan gerrymandering violated the state constitution. In the court's decision, it was Hofeller's files that helped prove that North Carolina Republicans drew these lines with the clear intention of benefiting themselves. Ultimately, the court said North Carolina Republicans had to redraw the state House and state Senate maps one more time. This new map, approved by North Carolina legislators, is much less biased toward one party, even though it took some extreme measures and nearly a decade to force politicians to draw a fair map. In the last few years, the courts in several states, like Florida and Pennsylvania, have made partisan gerrymandering much harder. And now that's also the case in North Carolina. Hofeller is gone now. But in other states across the country, many maps he helped draw are still in use. And while there's now a clearer strategy to challenge those maps in state courts, many voters are still effectively not choosing their representatives. It's like Hofeller said, the representatives are choosing the voters.
Of course, redistricting is democracy at work. Redistricting is like an election in reverse. It's a great event.
We've left untouched the biggest segregation of all that overwhelms everything else and hangs over our entire society, and that is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. There are clearly defined areas in every one that I've lived in that are all white or mostly white, or all African American and mostly African American. And all of us accept this as part of the natural environment. It's not we think it's a good thing. We know we say it's too bad, but we think it's sort of natural, normal, something we accept. It's not that we've tried to do anything about it and have failed. We've never even tried. And so in order to rationalize to ourselves our failure to undo it, we've adopted the national myth. And that myth is pervasive. It's pervasive across the political spectrum. The liberals and conservatives hold it. The blacks and whites
hold it. The name of that myth is we have de facto segregation. Not something that was created by government like all the other segregations that we undid in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, but this is something that sort of just happened by accident. It happened because people like to live with each other of the same race. Or it happened because private actors, whether they were real estate agents or bankers or private citizens, discriminated in how they sold or rented homes. Or it happened because African Americans happen to be poorer than whites on average, and therefore they can't afford to move to middle-class communities. De facto segregation is an utter myth. There is no basis to it whatsoever. The racial segregation in every metropolitan area in this country was created by racially explicit government policy designed to create racial boundaries, designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another, with policies that are so powerful that they still determine the racial landscape that we see in cities all over the country. Just like we have the myth of de facto segregation, we also think we know what public housing is. It's a place where poor people live, where lots of mothers with children, single parents with children, lots of young men without access to jobs in the formal economy, acting out, engaging in oppositional behavior that attracts attention to the police and a cycle of violence that we've seen in so many places. That's what we think of as public housing. But that's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in this country as a program for middle-class, working-class families. During the Depression, poor people were not permitted into public housing when public housing was first created. There was a housing shortage, and public housing was created for people who could afford to pay the full rent in housing, and they did in public housing, but for whom there was no housing available. Everywhere, the Public Works Administration and the other federal agencies that succeeded it created segregated public housing, separate projects for African Americans and whites in cities all across the country, frequently segregating neighborhoods that hadn't previously been segregated, that were integrated. During World War II, the actions of the government intensified to create segregation. They intensified because throughout the country, hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of defense production, of war production, to take jobs that hadn't existed during the Depression. And the migration of workers into centers of defense production overwhelmed frequently the communities where they were working. The federal government had to build housing for these workers if wanted the ships to be produced. For the African Americans, they built the housing on temporary housing because the explicit goal of the housing was that African Americans after World War II would leave and go back to the South. So they built temporary housing for the African Americans along the railroad tracks and near the shipyards, and they built more stable housing for the white migrants in the white residential areas. Very soon after that, in the mid-1950s, a development occurred everywhere in the country, which was systematic, similar, and widespread. And that was that suddenly, all the white projects began to develop large numbers of vacancies. All the black projects began to develop long waiting lists. And soon the situation became so untenable, so conspicuous. You couldn't have projects in the same city, some of which were virtually empty, and the other of which had long waiting lists. The federal government and local housing agencies opened up all projects to African Americans. And then at about the same time, industry left the cities. Fewer and fewer jobs became available to the now increasingly and soon almost all African American population in the public housing. The population could no longer afford to pay the full cost of its rent, so the government had to begin subsidizing public housing. Maintenance declined in the projects. Prior to this, maintenance workers lived in the projects. They were paid good salaries and lived in the projects. Upkeep declined. The projects became vertical slums that we came to associate with public housing today. Another federal program that was perhaps even more powerful in creating racial segregation, and that was a program of the Federal Housing Administration designed to move white families out of urban areas into single-family homes in the suburbs. At a racially explicit basis, we created a white noose around every urban area with federally subsidized single-family home subdivisions. These were giant subdivisions in many cases. The most famous of them, I'm sure you've heard of it, is Levittown, east of New York City. 17,000 homes in one place. What bank would be crazy enough to lend a developer the money to build 17,000 homes or 15,000 homes in one place for which he had no buyers? We were in a suburban country at that time.
People thought the whole idea was lunacy. Who's going to want to live in a single-family home when they can live in the city instead? Any of these developers, the only way they could get the capital to build these giant subdivisions was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, submitting their plans for the development, for approval of the construction materials they were going to use, the architectural design, the layout of the streets in the subdivision, and an explicit commitment not to sell a home to an African American, required by the Federal Housing Administration. The Federal Housing Administration even required, as a condition of these guarantees, developers like Levitt to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. These deeds still exist in these homes today. They're no longer enforced, no longer enforceable, but they're still there. What was the consequence of this? Well, those homes in those days, in all of these suburbs, they sold for $10,000 or less, $8,000, $9,000 a piece. In today's money, that's less than $100,000, probably $90,000. African Americans who were prohibited, not they didn't want to, not because they didn't like living among whites, they were prohibited from moving into these suburbs, and they could easily afford to do so. Any working class family can afford to buy a home for $90,000, roughly twice national median income. Those homes and developments like that now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 and more. The white families over the next couple of generations gained, you can do the arithmetic, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 in equity. They used that equity to send their children to college, to take care of medical emergencies, to take care of economic downturns, most importantly, to bequeath it to their children, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans who accumulated none of that wealth as a result of this federal subsidy had none of those abilities. Today, nationwide, African American incomes are on average about 60% of white incomes. African American wealth today is 10% of white wealth. That enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy practiced in the mid-20th century that has never been remedied. It's a constitutional violation, and of course it determines the ongoing racial inequalities we have today.
Now, with their majorities secured by gerrymandering, many red map Republican legislatures executed the next power play, passing harsh new voter restriction laws.
What you see is an outcropping across the country of bills in state legislatures that are dominated by Republicans, bills that require new kinds of hurdles that voters have to leap over in order to be able to vote.
In 2011, Wisconsin, a red map state, debated a new voter ID law. The law mandated that those without an acceptable ID, like a state driver's license, would need a birth certificate or passport, social security number, and proof of state residency to vote or register to vote. In short, more hurdles, more bureaucracy, make it harder to vote.
Clerk will read the bill.
Senate Bill 7, relating to requiring certain identification in order to vote at a polling place or obtain an absentee ballot, verification of the addresses of electors, absentee voting procedure in certain residential care apartment complexes and adult family homes, identification cards issued by the Department of Transportation.
I got involved when I was very young. My granddad was a Republican, so I said, I'll be a Republican. And he felt it was kind of like this family. So for me, I think it was a sense of belonging, a sense of, hey, I'm working for something.
In 2011, Todd Albaugh was a Republican staffer. He had a front row seat on the passage of Wisconsin's voter ID law.
The chair of the Senate Election Committee at the time stood up and kind of hit her finger on the counter, and she said, look, we got to start thinking about what this is going to mean if this passes to neighborhoods around Milwaukee and the college campuses. What Senator Lozick was referring is, hey, if we can suppress the college vote, and if we can suppress the minority vote in Milwaukee, it gives us a pretty good leg up on any future elections.
And today, this is not a voter ID bill. This is voter suppression,
It's voter disenfranchisement. This is voter confusion. This is voter restriction. This is voter discouragement bill.
The term voter suppression was never used in the room, but everybody got the idea of what was being said. Just they could see it on some of these senators, the light in their eye, they got it. Because there are only so many white, straight, old men left. So the only way to win is to scare the shit out of people and to suppress the vote. And I saw it firsthand.
I think the vast majority of our citizens want to make sure that their vote is a legal vote and that all the votes out there are legal votes, because one fraudulent vote cancels out a legal vote.
And so I went to Facebook and said, this is why I left the Republican Party.
So there are all kinds of forms of ID that were permissible prior to these voter ID laws. No, these voter ID laws are premised on the idea of creating a form of identification that is going to require voters to go through hoops in order to get it. Now, what kind of voters am I talking about? The average middle-class voter will say, I have a driver's license, or I have a passport.
As many as 90% of registered voters have one of these forms of ID. It's in their pocket, and they think, what's the big deal? But here's the thing, 90% of people have it. That means that 10% of people don't.
If you live in rural places and you have to drive, and these motor vehicle offices are few and far between, and they're not open on the weekend, and they're not open in the evenings, and when you get there, then you've got to have the underlying identification that would allow them to give you the ID that you need to vote. For example, that you have to have a birth certificate. Well, some of us have our birth certificate and some of us don't. Some of us wouldn't know how to get it. So it may cost you $15 to get the birth certificate. So you have to now add the travel costs, the time off work, the $15, all to get the voter ID so that you can exercise this right that the Supreme Court in 1886 said was preservative of all rights, the right to vote.
The Supreme Court in 1966 said that a poll tax of $1.50 is unconstitutional. And if that's the case, then our view is no one should have to pay $10, $20, or $40 to get a card so that they can vote.
If we could put ID easily into the hands of every voter in our country, then I wouldn't have a problem with it. But the reality is that getting access to government-issued ID today requires jumping through a lot of hoops and hurdles.
And there's one thing that I think is really worth pointing out, and that's having an ID and having an ID to vote in Wisconsin are very different things.
My name's Molly. If you haven't met me, what I can do is get you everything that you need to vote.
Vote Riders is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization and really focused primarily on voter ID. We're going to make sure everybody can vote.
So we can get you an ID from Wisconsin too, because you need one of those when you go and vote.
I grew up in a household where we're encouraged to be civically active and to vote.
In the bill, that's all you need to vote. So you can
and if somebody needs help exercising their fundamental right to vote, we should all be stopping what we're doing and figuring out what we can do as a society to make that better.
Because this is about you, this is about the voters, and the people who are impacted. I can vote, but, you can't. And then I also wanted to talk about when you want to go back to the DMV.
They want to get the ID now.
Zach is one of the voters that I actually met here at First United Methodist Church doing regular community outreach.
I didn't think it would take all this to get an ID to vote.
When President Obama got elected, I voted then, so ever since then I've been trying to vote in every election.
Zach had a pay stub, he had his social security card, but he didn't have a birth certificate.
I'll let you hold on to these again. Okay, hang on.
Okay. And we went to the DMV, and they still told me I needed my birth certificate. I felt like I had all the right information. They were trying to just have me go around a ringer just for a birth certificate.
Voter ID laws impact certain demographics. They impact low-income voters, they impact voters of color, they impact first-time voters and voters new to Wisconsin, they impact students, they impact older voters who no longer have a driver's license. here, they make it very difficult to vote. And based on the legislature's own admission and testimony in federal court, that doesn't seem to be a mistake.
The court heard evidence and concluded that there were 300,000 registered voters in the state of Wisconsin who lacked one of the forms of ID is acceptable under the law.
They're trying to make it where only the rich vote for the rich. I thought it was going to be simple, but it wasn't.
The studies are very, very consistent that barriers that you put in front of the ballot box are going to stop some people from voting.
The true objective of voter ID laws in Wisconsin and other states was clear to the politicians passing these laws.
It's something we're working on all over the country because in the states where they do have voter ID laws, you've seen actually elections begin to change towards more conservative candidates.
Voter ID, which is going to allow Governor Romney to win the state of Pennsylvania. Done.
The Republicans since 1984 in the presidential races have not been able to win in Wisconsin. Why would it be any different?
And now we have photo ID, and I think photo ID is going to make a little bit of a difference as well.
The law is going to kick the Democrats in the butt. If it hurts a bunch of college kids that's too lazy to get up off their bohunkers and go get a photo ID, so be it.
Right.
If it hurts a bunch of lazy blacks that wants the government to give them everything, so be it.
And it just so happens that a lot of those people vote Democrat.
Gee.
It's astonishing, actually, 50 years plus after the Voting Rights Act was passed, that we still have to do voting rights enforcement and protection.
I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy. I will send to Congress a law designed to eliminate illegal barriers to the right to vote.
The Voting Rights Act shook up politics. Within weeks of the Voting Rights Act becoming law, black voters were being registered by the thousands in the South. And within a few years, their voter participation rates were nearly the same as white voters.
After 2010, many red map states enacted voter restriction laws. However, the 1965 Voting Rights Act prevented most southern states from following suit. The act required that those states seek approval or pre-clearance from the U.S. Department of Justice in order to change their voting laws. Well, this was a problem, since the South is key to Republican success. So, some of the same conservative groups that fueled Red Map now funded a Supreme Court challenge to the Voting Rights Act. The goal? Do away with the pre-clearance requirement. The case was called Shelby County versus Holder.
June 25th marks the 7-year anniversary of an incredibly important and often overlooked Supreme Court decision, Shelby County v. Holder, which ruled crucial voter protections from the 1965 Voting Rights Act unconstitutional and outdated. This decision puts many communities, especially elderly, low-income, minorities, and student groups, at risk of voter suppression and discrimination. To understand the impacts of this case, we first need to understand the impacts of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Widely considered to be the most effective piece of civil rights legislation in U.S. history, the act aimed to protect Black citizens' voting rights and outlaw discriminatory practices. A crucial part of these protections were largely dependent on two key sections, Section 4B and Section 5. Section 5 of the VRA required jurisdictions with a history of voter discrimination and suppression to seek preclearance from the federal government before changing their voting laws. The formula for identifying these districts was established in Section 4B. States such as Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Texas, and Virginia were all obligated to submit election plans to prevent voter suppression, especially on the basis of race. Now, what changed after the Supreme Court decision? Why do people often say it gutted the VRA? Well, in 2010, when Shelby County, Alabama challenged its preclearance requirements, the Supreme Court was left to debate the constitutionality of Section 4B and 5. In a 5-4 decision, the court concluded that the formula in Section 4B was decades old, targeted practices that had been eradicated as the country had changed, and the racial disparity in voter registration and turnout was no longer the case in 2013. Without the formula, Section 5 was unenforceable. This means that regions with a history of racial discrimination no longer have federal oversight for their voting processes. Dissenting justices said that the only reason these practices didn't exist was because the preclearance requirement was doing its job. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg likened the decision to, quote, throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. Because the court only struck down the formula for determining which jurisdiction should be subject to preclearance and did not strike down preclearance itself, Congress can pass a new coverage formula at any time. But, as we know, it has been 7 years since the Shelby County v. Holder decision, and Congress still hasn't created a new formula. However, simply reinstating Section 4 of the VRA would not be enough. Even before 2013 and the Shelby County decision, states without preclearance requirements were enacting stricter laws and discriminatory practices. The criteria for preclearance must be expanded and strengthened in order to protect American citizens. If you can, get out and vote. To register online and for more info, visit rockthevote.com.
When Joseph Johnson went to vote in his first presidential election, this isn't what he expected.
The line went this way in front of our auditorium and then snaked around into our library.
The last person at his polling location didn't get to vote until 1 a.m.
It was the longest line that I've ever waited in my entire life. Some people, they were just like, well, screw it.
This was in a heavily Democratic part of Houston, Texas, and it was a primary election where Democrats and Republicans were voting on separate machines. But the county had given both parties the same number of machines to use. Also, Texas had closed hundreds of polling locations in recent years, meaning more people had to vote at fewer places. But not everyone has to wait. This is a map of all the polling locations in Josephs County that had reports of long lines. And here's the percentage of non-white voters in each area. Notice how most places with lines were in less white areas? The poll closures and the other decisions that led to those lines disproportionately affected people of color. And whether or not that was intentional, those kinds of decisions in places like Texas used to be highly regulated and much less frequent. Today, that oversight is gone, but the 2020 election could decide whether it comes back. This is the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. In 1965, a group of civil rights activists, including the future Congressman John Lewis, marched across the bridge and were attacked and beaten by police. They were marching for voting rights. Back then, especially in the segregated South, there was rampant voter suppression of Black Americans. It started back when the 15th Amendment granted black men the right to vote in 1870. That right was enforced by federal troops who occupied the southern states during a period known as Reconstruction.
But what happened after Reconstruction was that the states passed a number of laws that effectively disenfranchised African Americans.
Of course, no law could say no black people can vote. It had to be a little sneakier, like the grandfather clause, where you could only vote if your grandfather could vote, which is impossible if your grandfather was a slave. There were literacy tests where voters, mostly black voters, had to answer bizarre questions before they were allowed to vote.
Not just tests to see whether or not you could read, but things like, could you recite the state's constitution?
And poll taxes, requiring voters, again mostly black voters, to pay to be allowed to vote.
They selectively chose who had to abide by these rules.
In the 1950s and 60s, Congress passed several civil rights laws that attempted to protect voting rights, getting rid of things like poll taxes. Still, by 1964, in Mississippi, barely 7% of non-white Americans could vote. Selma's Bloody Sunday drew attention to that. It made Americans and Congress wonder if local officials like these guys could really be entrusted to enforce these new civil rights laws. So Congress wrote another one. 10 days after Selma, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was introduced. It added additional protections, got rid of literacy tests, but it also had a way to prevent any other creative changes.
State governments had to submit their changes to the federal government for approval.
The Voting Rights Act identified parts of the country that had a history of voter discrimination, mostly in the South, and set up federal oversight. So if these places wanted to change anything about voting, like enacting a new law or closing polling locations, it first had to get the okay from the U.S. Justice Department or federal courts that it wasn't discriminatory. Immediately, non-white voter registration in these southern states grew, like in Mississippi, where it went from barely 7% to almost 60% in just 3 years. The Voting Rights Act did what earlier civil rights laws hadn't. But in 2013, the Supreme Court, with a majority of Republican-appointed judges, took on a case about the Voting Rights Act. They decided that the way the law calculated which states would have that federal oversight was outdated and therefore unconstitutional.
No one doubts that there is still voting discrimination in the South and in the rest of the country. We do, however, find that the coverage formula in Section 4 violates the Constitution.
Almost immediately, voting laws that had been previously denied for being discriminatory were enacted in these states. Literally the same day as the Supreme Court's decision, Texas did just that, announcing a voter ID law that a federal judge had previously rejected because it was the most stringent in the country and imposed strict, unforgiving burdens on the poor. Other states enacted voter ID laws too, along with other measures that had been previously stopped, like purging voter rolls and closing polling locations. 1,173 places in total, 750 just in Texas. An analysis by The Guardian looked at the 50 Texas counties that gained the most Black and Hispanic residents from 2012 to 2018, and the 50 Texas counties that gained the fewest Black and Hispanic residents. In these counties, the combined population fell by 13,000 over that time, and 34 of their polling places were closed. In these counties, the combined population grew by 2.5 million people, but 542 of their polling places closed. Many officials in these states say changes like these aren't intended to disenfranchise specific voters, but there's no way to really know. What we do know is that almost all these states' governments are controlled by Republicans, and the groups that tend to be disenfranchised by these changes are more often poor people and people of color, most of whom tend to vote Democratic.
Even when they're saying it's not, it's very hard to believe that, in fact, they didn't have a strategic discussion about how they could minimize the Democratic Party's vote.
In the Supreme Court decision, the Chief Justice told Congress it's okay to have oversight, just don't base it on old data.
Congress must ensure that the legislation it passes speaks to current conditions.
And so in 2019, the House of Representatives did just that, passing a new bill to update the criteria for which states get federal oversight. John Lewis, then a congressman in his 17th term, presided over the vote. But the bill passed almost entirely along party lines. Almost no Republicans voted for it, and nearly every Democrat did. Then the bill moved to the Republican-held Senate, where it isn't going to get a vote. And even if it does pass the Senate, the Trump White House has threatened to veto it, arguing the oversight is unnecessary. But the House, Senate, and White House are all up for grabs in the 2020 election. And this is one of the many areas the two presidential candidates have polar opposite views.
Pass the bill to restore the Voting Rights Act. It's one of the first things I'll do as president if elected.
In 2020, John Lewis died. The bill whose passage he presided over was renamed in his memory. If the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act becomes law, its formula would restore federal oversight for several states, including Texas.
It's like if there are no rules to the game, then no one can really play the game.
First, though, a landmark day for the Supreme Court as it struck down a key section of the landmark Voting Rights Act that was created to prevent discrimination at polling places.
This is a critical day for Democratic participation in America. This decision by the court is a game changer and leaves virtually unprotected minority voters in communities all over this country.
When we think something like voting rights is something everybody believes and that progress only goes in one direction, we've seen sudden reverses. We've seen that history can go in the wrong direction.
I mean, the ink wasn't even dry on the opinion. And the next thing you know, the states raced to the clerk's offices with legislation that would do harm to people's rights to vote.
As soon as the Shelby decision was announced, North Carolina legislative leaders said, now we can go for the full bill. And the full bill was the monster vote suppression bill.
So what do we have? We have 53 pages about reducing access and subtracting options, making it harder for people to vote.
There's a care that's exercised, right, around the creation of these laws. And in North Carolina, the Republicans asked for information. They identified those ways of voting that were more likely to be accessed by the African American community, and those were the ones that they outlawed in that omnibus law.
Legislators asked for the demographics. And when the Republican Party received the information that the highest percentage, something like 70% of African Americans used the first week of early voting, that's what they cut. Every decision they made it after they knew the impact it would have on African Americans, Latinos, people of color, and poor people.
Some Republicans have admitted that this was a way to make it a little bit tougher on Democratic voters.
And for a moment, I want to have a grown-up conversation about racism. See, racism is not just about somebody calling you the N-word. Most modern day racists are too smart for that anyhow. Racism is about policy. Racism is about the ability to take your prejudice and implement policy. Since 2008, we've seen an all-out effort by extremists in suits and ties who sit in political seats working to abridge and deny the right to vote.
I have 500 years of ministry in my family on my father's side. So when I decided to go to college, I picked a school that had no courses in religion. Because I didn't want to go into ministry. I wanted to go to law school, and that was my intention. But I had a very spiritual experience in 1984. I accepted the call to ministry. But it's always been from the beginning I don't know any way to be Christian without being involved in justice.
What Reverend Barber and other leaders in North Carolina did following the enactment of these vote suppression laws, I think had a big impact in a positive way.
They do not want the people to vote.
Reverend Barber was really at a time where I think many people were demoralized, really being a strong voice, saying these are fundamental issues that we're going to fight for. And when you had waves and waves of people at the legislature every week willing to be arrested,
I shall not be moved like a tree standing by the water. I shall not be moved.
that was a real sign that they weren't going to let voting rights be given up without a fight.
Nearly 1,200 people went to jail. I was arrested here about 6 times. And I like to connect it because voting rights is not just a black issue. Black and white Republicans and Democrats joined us in getting arrested.
Come on, don't you wanna go?
I am Rosa Nell Eaton, 92 years old. I am before you today to speak on voting rights. I am fed up and fired up. Said fed up, fired up, fired up. Thank you so very much.
And so we had this ritual that at the end of the rally, everybody that was going in to be arrested would line up. So I saw Miss Eaton going in the line with her walker. I was raised in the South, so I'm taught to respect my elders and care for them. I said, Miss Rosanelle, you're gonna have to do this. You can sit this one out, we got it. She said, you back up, I got this. And she led about 150 people who all got arrested that day. Rosanelle walked with Dr. King. Dr. King encouraged and inspired her. She's registered thousands of people to vote in her life. She's faced the Klan. She wasn't always nonviolent because she had seen the Klan burn crosses in front of her yard.
I remember her standing at the kitchen counter one day, and all of a sudden I heard her say, I didn't ever think I would have to go through this again before I got in the grave. And I knew she was dead serious because she thought certain battles were already fought.
To justify new voter restriction laws like North Carolina's HB 589, politicians needed a cover, a compelling reason to fix an election system that wasn't broken. This helped give rise to the so-called voter integrity movement, which took off after Obama's 2008 election.
If you care about vote fraud, gentlemen, we're fighting it. We could use your help. Thanks. Hey, if you care about vote fraud, we're fighting it. We could use your help. If you care about vote fraud, gentlemen, we could use your help. Thanks. Thank you.
I know a girl who votes 8 times and has $1 million in the bank and is on food stamps and gets everything for free, including college.
How do you know she votes 8 times?
Because we know her. She does.
Would you call me later after the election?
Republicans saw an opportunity where they could go into states and build this notion of voter fraud, get people scared about it, scared enough that they would create new laws that would heighten the threshold to qualify to vote and make that qualification so difficult that it would suppress voters, and not coincidentally people who would vote against them. It's just a very well-organized, well-staffed, well-resourced operation that once they get an idea, they can spread it like a dandelion.
Voter turnout during the 2020 presidential election in the state of Georgia shattered records. Millions voted early or mailed in ballots. Now the state is ground zero for an avalanche of bills that could sharply restrict voter access. The bills proposed by state Republicans would curtail mail-in voting, impose strict identification rules, and limit the use of ballot drop boxes. Similar legislation is being pushed in over 40 states. Civil rights groups and Democrats say it's a deliberate attempt to suppress black and brown voters.
I will be damned if I let the fight of my forefathers, my ancestors looking at me, and I roll over and lay down and allow them to do this. So we will fight in here. You fight out here, and we will win.
We will stop the steal.
Republicans say the new laws aim to restore faith in the electoral process. For months, former President Trump and his allies made baseless claims the election was stolen. To mark the recent 65th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, a turning point in the civil rights movement, President Biden signed an executive order aimed at expanding voting rights. The House of Representatives also passed similar legislation, but the so-called For the People Act is likely to face a tough battle in the Senate.
The blood of John Lewis and so many other brave and righteous souls that was spilled in Selma on this Sunday in 1965 sanctified a noble struggle. And when the country saw those images that night, America was forced to confront the denial of democracy, the fierce urgency of justice.
Other Republican-backed bills in Georgia would restrict early voting, including on Sundays, traditional Souls to the Polls Day for African Americans.
We're still going to vote in record numbers. We're going to turn out. We're going to organize our people. But what we are saying right now is that these voter suppression bills, it's bad for democracy, and we shouldn't even have to be here fighting this same battle all over again.
For both the Democrats and the Republicans, this is now a fight for the soul of democracy. Many on the right believe the 2020 election was stolen despite evidence to the contrary. Those on the left want to expand and enshrine the right to vote. If these measures are passed, they will potentially put hurdles in place for tens of millions of voters.
There is no belief in actual voter fraud. What there is an attempt to restrict voter access that is using the specter of voter fraud, which is hard to prove because it doesn't exist, so you can pretend that the reason no one knows about it is because it's been so effective. So you create this boogeyman that can only be disproven by another boogeyman.
So I looked into how fraud of various kinds occurs, and in particular I focused in on one kind of voter fraud, pretending to be somebody else when you walk into a polling place. I started the study in 2000, went through 2014. Out of 1 billion ballots cast, I found at the time 31 incidents, credible raising a hand, somebody has pretended to be somebody else at the polling place. When you dig in, when you actually look incident by incident, a lot of the allegations vanish.
Another analysis found that out of 197 million votes cast for federal elections between 2002 and 2005, only 40 voters out of 197 million were indicted for fraud. As a percentage that is 0.00002%. That's not a lot.
Most voter fraud allegations are driven by what some might term untruths. Others, less generously, call them the big lie.
President Trump again this week suggested in a meeting with senators that thousands of illegal voters were bused from Massachusetts to New Hampshire.
I can tell you that this issue of busing voters into New Hampshire is widely known. It's very real. It's very serious. This morning on this show is not the venue for me to lay out all the evidence.
Joining me now, someone who knows New Hampshire politics very, very well, a Republican who ran the state's party over the last decade, Fergus Cullen. You, sir, on Twitter, are offering $1,000 to anyone who can prove what Stephen Miller was claiming. Do you have any takers?
So far, shockingly, no one has been able to come up with any evidence, no pictures of one of these magic buses delivering hundreds, if not thousands, of people from Massachusetts to New Hampshire. No one has any evidence at all.
You know, the buses are red meat to some activists. I got a call from somebody going, hey, there's buses. They urged me and begged me to get over here as fast as I could to check it out, but I don't see any buses.
Something significant shifted in America over the last decade or so. And it's pretty simple. It shifted from people thinking there was opportunity to thinking that opportunity is being taken away from them. That others, you define that however you want, are coming across the borders or from wherever, and they are changing our way of life. One place I can lay that blame is to say people are stealing elections. Those other people, that other party, those people that are trying to take stuff away from me are doing it illegally. Because people don't want to say it's, people don't want to admit that life changes.
Income inequality has always existed in the U.S., but the gap between rich and poor hasn't always been as wide as it is today. Let's take a look at how economic and political forces have changed the share of income held by the whole bottom 50% and just the top 1% of earners. The mid-century was a period of economic stability. The richest 1% earned 13% of all U.S. income, while the bottom half earned 20% of income. In the 1960s, Americans were still riding a post-war job boom. In the 70s, the lowest-paid Americans got a boost from a steadily increasing minimum wage. Sky-high salaries weren't as typical as they are today. The 80s changed everything. Minimum wage stagnated. Factory jobs were automated or outsourced. Ronald Reagan passed huge tax cuts for the richest, and executive pay soared. By the mid-90s, the earnings of the top 1% surpassed everyone in the bottom half altogether. The rich were on a tear, and even financial crashes in the 2000s didn't slow them down. Today, the share of income claimed by those at the very top and those in the bottom half are completely reversed from what they were in the 60s. Other countries don't have such a wide gap between rich and poor. Among economically developed nations, the U.S. is one of the most unequal, according to the Gini Index, which rates places based on how wealth is distributed. The higher the number, the more unequal the country is. The top 1% in the U.S. is primarily made up of men. Women-dominated fields like teaching and waitressing are lower paying. Women are promoted less often than men. They make 82 cents for every dollar that men make. The top tier is also very white. Minority groups face systemic racism that has contributed to gaps in education, housing, and employment opportunities. African Americans make only 78 cents for every dollar white people make. Inequality varies across the U.S. because of regional economics. Large urban areas like New York City are more unequal because they have low-income residents as well as those in tech, finance, and other industries that offer sky-high wages. Whereas the Great Lakes region is more equal because the wage gap there isn't as wide. Race plays a role too. Southern states, which are generally more racially diverse, tend to be more unequal, while pockets of the West that are more white tend to be more equal. Upward social mobility is especially challenging for those at the very bottom. The rich tend to stay rich, and the poor tend to stay poor. So what could be done? Some legislators have proposed putting the brakes on runaway wealth by raising income taxes on top earners. Many states recently increased the minimum wage, and some states are closing education gaps by expanding access to early learning programs. But on a federal level, there's no consensus, and ultimately, closing the gap between rich and poor will require agreement from an increasingly partisan government, as well as societal shifts to combat sexism and racism. Change isn't around the corner, but understanding how we got here in the first place is a good first step.
So America may be speaking out, but Republicans in Congress sure aren't listening. They want to put special interests back in the driver's seat in Washington. They want to roll back the law that will finally stop health insurance companies from denying you coverage on the basis of a pre-existing condition. They want to repeal reforms that will finally protect hardworking families from hidden rates and penalties every time they use a credit card, make a mortgage payment, or take out a student loan. And for all their talk about reining in spending and getting our deficits under control, they want to borrow another $700 billion and use it to give tax cuts to millionaires and billionaires. On average, that's a tax cut of about $100,000 for millionaires. Instead of cutting taxes for the wealthiest few, tax breaks we cannot afford, I've called for tax cuts for middle-class families who saw their income shrink by 5% during the last lost decade. We've already cut 8 different taxes for small business owners to help them hire and grow, and we're going to cut 8 more. We're challenging our states and schools to do a better job educating our kids and making college more affordable so America can once more lead the world in the proportion of our children graduating from college. And we're putting an end to the days of taxpayer-funded bailouts so Main Street never again has to pay for Wall Street's mistakes. America is a great country. Our democracy is vibrant, our economy is dynamic, and our workers can outcompete the best of them. But the way for us to remain the greatest country on earth isn't to turn back the clock and put the special interests back in charge. It's to make sure all our people are getting a fair shake. It's to make sure everyone who's willing to work for it still has a chance to reach for the American dream. And that will remain my mission every single day, so long as I have the honor of serving as president. Over the last few months, I've been talking about a choice we face as a country. We can either settle for an economy where a few people do really well and everybody else struggles to get by, or we can build an economy where hard work pays off again, where everyone gets a fair shot, everyone does their fair share, and everyone plays by the same rules. That's up to us. And today I want to talk to you about the idea that everyone in this country should do their fair share. Now, if this were a perfect world, we'd have unlimited resources. No one would ever have to pay any taxes, and we could spend as much as we wanted. But we live in the real world. We don't have unlimited resources. We have a deficit that needs to be paid down. And we also have to pay for investments that will help our economy grow and keep our country safe. Education, research and technology, a strong military, and retirement programs like Medicare and Social Security. That means we have to make choices. When it comes to paying down the deficit and investing in our future, should we ask middle-class Americans to pay even more at a time when their budgets are already stretched to the breaking point? Or should we ask some of the wealthiest Americans to pay their fair share? That's the choice. Over the last decade, we've spent hundreds of billions of dollars on what was supposed to be a temporary tax cut for the wealthiest 2% of Americans. Now we're scheduled to spend almost $1 trillion more. Today, the wealthiest Americans are paying taxes at one of the lowest rates in 50 years. Warren Buffett is paying a lower rate than his secretary. Meanwhile, over the last 30 years, the tax rates for middle-class families have barely budged. That's not fair. It doesn't make any sense. Do we want to keep giving tax breaks to the wealthiest Americans, folks like myself or Warren Buffett or Bill Gates,
people who don't need them and never asked for them? Or do we want to keep investing in the things that will grow our economy and keep us secure? Because we can't afford to do both. Now, some people call this class warfare, but I think asking a billionaire to pay at least the same tax rate as his secretary is just common sense. We don't envy success in this country. We aspire to it. But we also believe that anyone who does well for themselves should do their fair share in return, so that more people have the opportunity to get ahead, not just a few. That's the America I believe in. And in the next few weeks, members of Congress will get a chance to show you where they stand. Congress is going to vote on what's called the Buffett rule. If you make more than $1 million a year, you should pay at least the same percentage of your income in taxes as middle-class families do. On the other hand, if you make under $250,000 a year, like 98% of American families do, your taxes shouldn't go up. You're the ones struggling with the rising cost of everything from college tuition to groceries. You're the ones who deserve a break. So every member of Congress is going to go on record. And if they vote to keep giving tax breaks to people like me, tax breaks our country can't afford, then they're going to have to explain to you where that money comes from. Either it's going to add to our deficit, or it's going to come out of your pocket. Seniors will have to pay more for their Medicare benefits. Students will see their interest rates go up at a time when they can't afford it. Families who are scraping by will have to do more because the richest Americans are doing less. That's not right. That's not who we are. In America, our story has never been about what we can do by ourselves. It's about what we can do together. It's about believing in our future and the future of this country. So tell your members of Congress to do the right thing. Call them up, write them a letter, pay them a visit, and tell them to stop giving tax breaks to people who don't need them and start investing in the things that will help grow our economy and put people back to work. That's how we'll make this country a little fairer, a little more just, and a whole lot stronger. Thanks.
What a great place. Thank you very much. So we have thousands of people outside trying to get in, but we should start. Do we agree?
We're fighting vote fraud if you are interested in that.
Of course, we were worried about vote fraud.
Yeah, I am too.
We're worried about
Read
vote
that.
fraud in North Carolina.
But people will. They'll vote many times. Somebody coming up and voting 15 times for Hillary.
I think he's going to win unless the only way she can win is if she steals the election.
That's what I'm afraid of too, which is why you need to read that and decide if you want to fight vote fraud, if you care about it.
And I will not tell you to vote 15 times. You won't vote 15 times.
In 2016, for the first time, a major party presidential candidate, Donald Trump, and his vice presidential running mate, Mike Pence, were preaching the gospel of voter fraud and rigged elections.
Do you agree with your running mate, Donald Trump, that polling places in this country are going to be rigged?
In recent years, we've had instances, proven instances of voter fraud.
In order to maintain political control, in order to maintain the systems that we have that benefit white people, it means that we have to, as a country and as a system, be able to keep people of color from voting and from their full political power.
To say that our intent is to try to disenfranchise any individual in the state of Missouri is completely absurd. That is a very serious accusation and very it's something that I don't take lightly. Your vote is your own, and it's extremely important in a democracy. I'm just trying to put more integrity into our voting process.
We're very honored to have the Reverend Cassandra Gould with us.
I wear this shirt. My mom's name was Carrie. My mom was, I was born in a little town in Alabama, 47 miles from Selma. My mother was a voter rights worker. I really used to get sick of my mom's stories about what it meant to be in Selma and how she marched and how she was there before Dr. King. Mom, I don't want to hear about Selma anymore. I mean, we got it made now. We can actually go and vote. So I thought. Voter restriction laws are designed to take us back to the time that my mother was fighting in Selma. It's dancing on the grave of civil rights workers who gave their lives so that people could vote. It is not just about photo ID. That is code word for let's cut out some citizens. And who are the legislators to get to decide who gets to have a right that they already have?
President-elect Trump has been quite active on Twitter, and he said, in addition to winning the Electoral College in a landslide, I won the popular vote if you deduct the millions of people who voted illegally.
The president-elect is absolutely correct when he says the number of illegal votes cast exceeds the popular vote margin between him and Hillary Clinton.
Our next guest, Greg Phillips, first tweeted the claim that 3 million people voted illegally. Do you know, and can you prove right now, that 3 million people voted illegally?
Yes.
Do you have the proof?
Yes.
Will you provide it?
Yes.
Can I have it?
No.
If you look at voter registration, you look at the dead people that are registered to vote, you're going to find, and we're going to do an investigation on it.
But 3 to 5 million illegal votes?
Well, we're going to find out, but it could very well be that much.
After the 2016 general election, I called all 50 secretaries of state, managed to reach 49 of them, and never found more than 1 or 2, at tops 3 or 4, suspected instances of fraud. Not proven, but suspected or alleged. Many states had none at all.
President, when we give up on truth, we concede power to those with the wealth and charisma to create spectacle in its place. Joining me now is Timothy Snyder, noted history professor at Yale University and author of On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. Thank you so much for being with us. I've been arguing, but without your academic credentials at all, that what we were seeing in the Capitol, the T-shirts, the anti-Semitism, the white separatism, as toxic as that is partly the result of this denial of truth, denial of the reality. You've connected the two, the denial of truth to fascism.
Well, a basic element of fascism is that you take the messiness of everyday life, the complicatedness of everyday life, and you replace it with a few or maybe just one big, simple claim. A big lie, which is the foundation of a story that explains everything. A big lie, which is so false that it divides the believers from the non-believers. And a big lie, which is about something so important that if you believe in it, then of course you feel compelled towards action or towards violent action. This is part of the story of the collapse of democracy in the first part of the 20th century, and I'm afraid it's part of our story now too.
What are the sources of this in our society that make so many people vulnerable to their own reality?
Yeah, I mean, you suggested already a historical source, which is that there is a falsehood deep within the way a lot of Americans, especially white Americans, think about history. We don't think enough about, or we think wrongly about, or we deny how undemocratic our society has often been towards African Americans in particular. When we don't recognize that part of our history, then we have a tendency to think, well, only people like us should be represented, or as the white supremacists in the Capitol said, this is our house. It doesn't belong to the voters, to all Americans. It only belongs to us. In the last decade or so, there's been another source, which is social media. Social media has killed local news, which once helped people keep people together by giving them common sets of facts about what matter to them. And social media draws us towards the things that get us excited, towards the things that we already believe. So Mr. Trump has been a kind of master of both of those traditions. He's been a master of telling his people that they're the only good Americans, and he's been a master of using social media to arouse people and to treat others as enemies.
How fragile is our democracy after 4 years, at least, of lies being told from the Oval Office, from the podium in the White House, from the State Department, places where we always expected at least fact-based reporting, from the intelligence leaders? How fragile are we now?
I mean, I think if we're honest about it, we recognize that democracy is always fragile. I mean, democracies usually come apart. If we're honest about it, we're more self-critical. We realize that there's nothing magical about America. There's nothing exceptional about America. If we want democracy, then we have to decide that we stand for democracy. And as you've been saying all along, if we want to have a democracy into the future, then we have to say we care about factuality, we care about truth, we care about supporting the press, especially the local press and the courageous people who make it their calling to bring us the truth. If our democracy is fragile now, then it was also fragile, let's be honest, 4 years ago. We're seeing Mr. Trump hasten us to the culmination of a lot of problems that we've already had. This is horrible. It's horrible to watch a scene in which our Capitol is invaded and in which people's lives were at risk. This could have been much worse. But we can also see this as an opportunity to understand ourselves better, our history better, and to take some clear steps to try to move ourselves towards being a better democracy.
And how much responsibility do others in the Republican Party and the Senate have who are denying the reality, even denying the reality of the Biden victory?
They bear a huge amount of responsibility. I mean, we could take it as given that Mr. Trump was going to lie and tell a big lie. In fact, he was saying all summer and all fall that whatever the results were, he was going to claim victory. So he was basically predicting his own lie. We could count on that. You're very much right. I mean, the problem is that the vast majority of congressional Republicans went along with the story in one way or another. They gave it oxygen in November and December. And thanks to that, above all, tens of millions of Americans came to believe it. If Republicans had said in November, okay, we lost the election, time to move on, the big lie would never have gotten off the ground. And this, by the way, suggests a simple solution. If Republicans want to get beyond Trumpism, they can do something which is going to be painful for a moment, which is going to feel good in the long run, which is just tell the simple truth about the election.
Timothy Snyder, Professor, thank you so very much, author of On Tyranny. Thanks for being with us.
A big call to make. CNN announces that we call Florida in the Al Gore column.
Turn the lights down. The party just got wilder.
Florida goes to Mr. Bush.
Bush wins. Headline of the hour. Folks, it might be premature.
So we take Florida away from George W. Bush.
This is no longer an election. This is like Alice in Wonderland.
The one thing no one expected in a presidential campaign is that we wouldn't know who won on Election Day.
Count our votes! Count our votes!
Bush versus Gore was a watershed moment where the curtain was lifted on our election system in the United States, and we realized we've got to do something to fix it. And in some ways, Congress did, but then there were the unintended or possibly intended consequences.
If you are just waking up and just tuning in, you should know that after a long night of swing votes, the presidential race is frankly still too close to call.
On November 8th, Kurt Browning, the supervisor of elections for Pasco County, woke to shocking news.
The vote is now so close between them that there will be an automatic recount.
What are you talking about recounts? I'm in bed. There's no recounts going on. And literally within 3 hours, we were in the throes of a recount.
The tug of war for the presidency is now down to the most local of politics, counties in Florida, precincts in Florida, where the recount has begun.
5A11 is a vote for Gore.
Under intense media scrutiny, the flaws in Florida's system became clear.
Vote-o-matic machines and conflicting rules about ballots and fuzzy rules about what is a vote.
It's slightly detached.
Democrats charge a confusing ballot layout led voters to think they were punching the ballot for Al Gore when they were actually voting for Reform Party candidate Pat Buchanan.
3,500 people did not vote for Pat Buchanan. Come on, this is heavily Democratic Palm Beach County.
It is a ballot that was approved by an elected Democratic official. And hey, guess what? There were no complaints until after the election.
As both campaigns launched lawsuits over the disputed results, accusations of partisanship fueled the tension.
I voted. Whether or not my vote counted, I don't know.
The question of who will be the next president is right on her desk. She's the Secretary of State, Katherine Harris.
As Secretary of State, I am Chief Elections Officer.
Harris was the state co-chair of George Bush's presidential campaign. Today, Governor Jeb Bush said she is doing a good job.
I think she's doing the right thing.
Political insiders say there is no evidence Harris is being manipulated by the Bushes.
What I think people didn't realize before 2000 is that the people running the elections had a huge stake in the outcome.
While each campaign battled it out in court, the recounts dragged on.
I make this record.
No, you don't need to make a record.
I do need to make the record.
We were in the middle of the final recount when somebody's phone in the room rings.
36 days after the election, the U.S. Supreme Court brought everything to a halt.
It does appear quite clear that George W. Bush, the eldest son of a former president, is going to be the president-elect of this country with the 25 electoral votes from Florida.
the court declared that the recounts violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause because there was no uniform standard for counting all ballots.
Good morning.
The overwhelming consensus after 2000 was that our electoral machinery was broken. We did not run elections as well as we should, and we should fix that.
In the fall of 2002, Congress passed a sweeping reform bill, the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA.
For the very first time, the national government will step up to the plate and meet its constitutional duty to uphold the soundness and sanctity of the ballot in this country.
This bill would provide almost $4 billion, much of it to individual states, to replace old voting machines, train poll workers, and combat fraud.
The heart of the reform was a promise to improve voting machines, to make the machines work better. That more or less has been kept, but a whole series of new problems were injected.
The bill attempts to address one of my key concerns, and that, of course, is the issue of voter fraud.
Senator Kit Bond led a Republican effort to fight potential fraud by requiring ID from first-time voters who registered by mail.
Senator Bond used to talk about a little dog in St. Louis getting registered to vote named Ritzy Meckler.
I have great respect for the dead, and I love dogs. I don't think either ones should vote.
While HAVA set minimum voting standards, it was up to the states to enact the reforms. And by 2011, many were passing voter ID laws that were tougher than what HAVA required. Florida already had one when Dennis Baxley, then a representative, took office in 2010.
I think voter identification is just a responsible act. If I go to a bank, I expect them to verify and protect my money and make sure I'm the one getting it.
You can't buy a beer, board a plane, or even rent a movie without showing proper ID. But voting? In most states, all you need is a name.
The idea that fraud is a bad thing is appealing to everyone. And so how can you object to fighting it? The complexity comes when you dig beneath the surface and find out there is essentially no such thing as voter fraud, and it is simply a way of making it harder to vote for constituencies that traditionally lean Democratic.
There are people who don't have the voter identification that they want to require, and they are hugely disproportionately African Americans, Latinos, naturalized citizens, and those groups tend to vote for Democrats.
Are they really trying to keep certain people from voting at all?
It became a lightning rod issue as people perceived that we were up to some nefarious project of depriving people of their vote. I couldn't dream of anything farther from the truth. We want it easy to vote and hard to cheat.
Multiple investigations have found little evidence of the widespread voter fraud that ID laws would target, but Republicans say that Democrats are hyping stories of voter suppression.
This is how Democrats try and motivate their voters. They try and keep them paranoid and angry to get them out to the polls.
Wendy Weiser, who tracks election law for the Brennan Center, says it's hard to fully quantify how much voter turnout is being affected. But the 2000 election made it clear that even a few thousand votes can have big consequences.
Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of voters here or there can really determine election outcomes. Politicians saw that small manipulations of the rules of elections can really make a difference.
In the past 2 years, almost every state in the country has introduced or passed some type of change or restriction to the voting laws.
In 2011 in Florida, Curt Browning had become the state's top election officer and saw firsthand what happened when the voting rules were changed.
Governor Rick Scott is expected to sign a bill that would drastically change Florida's election laws.
Let us vote! Let us vote!
A Republican-led effort to cut early voting and later purge non-citizens from the voting rolls became national news.
Supporters say the law will prevent fraud, but voters' rights groups say it's a blatant attempt to suppress voting.
I sit here oftentimes when I was an election supervisor saying, why is this so difficult? Why is this so hard? And I will tell you what makes it hard. It's the politics. The candidates are all out to make sure that their voters are getting registered and their voters are voting.
Browning left office before the election, and the new law was blamed in part for long lines at the polls and a vote count that took 4 days.
Florida voters who were in lines up to 7 hours on Election Day say the entire process is embarrassing.
Florida tonight remains too close to call. So where's the good news, you say? Here it is. The election was decided without them.
In the years since Bush v. Gore, the voting wars show no sign of slowing.
This voting system is out of control. You have people, in my opinion, that are voting many, many times.
Stop fear-mongering about a phantom epidemic of election fraud.
Since 2013, nearly 24 states have enacted new voting regulations, ranging from purging voter rolls to imposing strict voter ID laws, a trend fueled after the Supreme Court threw out part of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which had protected the rights of minority voters in certain states.
The two biggest drivers of restricted voting laws are partisanship and race. The greater the increase in political participation by minority voters and the greater the Republican control of the state, the more likely the state is to pass laws cutting back on voting rights.
Some states have made it easier to vote, with automatic registration and mail-in voting. And in 2020, in response to fears over the coronavirus, many states loosened restrictions on voting by mail. But that quickly became a political piñata.
They're sending millions of ballots all over the country. There's fraud. No one has established at all that there is fraud related to mail-in ballots.
We can't just rest our entire voting rights in the hands of politicians. Whether their self-interest is expanding voting access or restricting voting access, their motives are not going to be pure.
What people thought Bush v. Gore did was expose a problem that politicians could solve. What in fact it did was it exposed an opportunity that politicians could exploit. And that's really been the most important legacy of Bush v. Gore.
But President Trump's voter fraud falsities are nothing new. In fact, many people saw it coming. Let's take a look.
So many cities are corrupt and voter fraud is very, very common.
That isn't a recent rally. It's from October 2016, when President Trump was then candidate Trump.
Voter fraud is all too common. And then they say, oh, there's no voter fraud in our country. There's no voter fraud.
But sentiments like this date back well before Trump's run for office. In 2012, he tweeted, quote, "Be careful of voter fraud." And on Election Day, he wrongly claimed polling machines switched votes from Romney to Obama. Sound familiar? In early 2016, after losing the Republican Iowa caucuses to Ted Cruz, Trump tweeted, "Ted Cruz didn't win Iowa. He stole it." But these unsubstantiated accusations continued even after the president's win in 2016.
What's going on with voter fraud is horrible. That's number one. Number two, I would have won the popular vote if I was campaigning for the popular vote.
Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by about 2.9 million votes that year. And early into his term, President Trump announced Vice President Pence would spearhead a commission investigating this alleged fraud.
This issue is very important to me because throughout the campaign, and even after, people would come up to me and express their concerns about voter inconsistencies and irregularities which they saw.
To be clear, President Trump didn't just invent claims of voter fraud. They're nothing new from the Republican Party. Voter ID laws have been implemented mostly by GOP legislatures as a way to combat fraud, of which very little evidence has ever been presented. Still, in 2008, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Indiana's law, leading to a surge in stricter requirements across the country.
But what we're seeing is that for partisan gain, these laws are being passed that literally will block people from exercising their right to vote.
There's a new voter ID law that has just gone into effect here. You have to have this. The school has given this to students that because their student IDs will not work.
In the states where they do have voter ID laws, you've seen actually elections begin to change towards more conservative candidates.
Now, 36 states have some sort of voter ID law. All this despite calls from opponents that claim these more rigorous laws suppress the voting rights of the elderly and poor. So, back to Trump's commission in 2017. Well, it came up short. The White House disbanded it less than a year later, claiming states weren't cooperating. Ultimately, the group never produced evidence of widespread fraud, though it did lead to a probe by the Government Accountability Office of the commission itself. But that didn't stop the president from pushing these unfounded beliefs.
In many places, like California, the same person votes many times. You got people voting that shouldn't be voting. Mail ballots are a very dangerous thing for this country because they're cheaters.
The most important thing to know about voter fraud is that it's extremely rare.
One study found only 10 examples of voter impersonation that could be prevented by voter ID laws over a 12-year period. Even the Conservative Heritage Foundation only found 1,300 instances of fraud since 1982. So we're talking thousands of cases across hundreds of millions of votes. Bottom line, it's just not a major problem in U.S. elections. This all brings us to today, with the president's legal team filing more than 40 lawsuits contesting election results.
It's a fraud, an absolute fraud.
But it's worth noting, by the lawyer's own admission, that many of these cases don't even address fraud. Instead, they talk about things like vote-by-mail deadlines and automated signature matching. And of the cases that do address fraud, the majority of them have either been dismissed or withdrawn. Even the Trump administration's own election security officials ultimately declared the 2020 election the most secure in history.
I do have confidence that the vote is secure, the count is secure, and the results will be secure.
Now, even though the president's claims don't carry any legal weight, they do come with some other consequences. One poll found 70% of Republican voters don't believe the 2020 election was free and fair. Another found 77% of Trump voters attributing Biden's win to fraud.
Rinse and repeat between 2016 and now. Now, an exhaustive investigation by the New York Times details how the president is using a decades-old playbook and the power of the federal government to cast doubt on the validity of the election should he not come out on top. Quote, the movement to convince the country that voter fraud is a present danger to democracy has itself become a present danger to democracy. It has melded fully into the president's re-election campaign. The argument is now that the only way Trump can lose this election is through sweeping voter fraud that benefits his opponent. Any outcome in which he does not win, therefore, can be considered illegitimate. This, Trump says, is why he refuses to commit to a peaceful transfer of power. Only fraud can beat him, and fraud is everywhere. Joining me now is New York Times and Sunday Magazine writer-at-large Jim Rutenberg. Jim, this reporting, as I said, is exhaustive. It is important. I'm so glad you did it. What Donald Trump is doing is not new to the Republican Party, frankly. You document how they've been doing or using tactics like this since the 1964 Civil Rights Act, again in 2000 with George Bush. How is Donald Trump, though, taking it further and using all of that groundwork laid before him to really put this next election in danger?
Well, you've never had a president take the ball and run with it. As you noted, and as the piece notes, the George W. Bush administration really picked up on this after Florida, after that recount. It really used voter fraud to try to drive a narrative in ways that they thought would help their political prospects. And the party really then ran with it during the Tea Party era. But Trump is himself an avatar of this voter fraud movement, and he's brought it into the presidency, and therefore he's using the federal government to combat this problem that doesn't really exist in the way he says it does, that definitively does not exist in the way he says it does.
How is he using the federal government?
Well, you see it every day. He started a presidential commission, which you guys covered a lot. That was meant to establish the sense that there's pervasive voter fraud, that we're going to give a federal government imprimatur to this idea. That commission floundered and fell apart. That work then moved to the DHS. The DHS picked it up, and it's hard to even see a lot of what they were doing because a lot of the documents we've gotten to look at are redacted, but they studied this issue, ideas like a national voter ID. Then we see even the effects that presidential influence can have in the Postal Service, and of course his Department of Justice, which now all eyes, and certainly in the Democratic Party and in the civil rights community, is watching the Department of Justice to see what it does, and potentially in tandem with Trump's poll watchers in November.
So all that groundwork that was laid in 2016 and 2017 and that presidential commission on voting that Chris Kobach was leading it. I remember having Chris Kobach on the air with me, and he was making absolutely no sense, trying to say that not only did we not know that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, but we couldn't even really know if Donald Trump won the vote. This says he's standing on the White House lawn. He made no sense. And when it was disbanded, I think a lot of people thought, all right, well, done with that. We don't have to worry about it. Is that the case?
Not done with that. And now we're seeing the results, right? Because you make a great point. Sometimes these notions, they make no sense. And whenever these voter fraud charges get into the court, they really reduce down to what we initially hear. And I warn everyone to look out for this. When you hear the sensational headlines about pervasive voter fraud, watch those cases. They really end up being a much smaller deal. But these arguments really can matter in a contested election setting, which the president well knows and his lawyers well know and his political aides well know. So you'll get these charges will be happening potentially during contested recounts, and they can carry the day in a way that maybe they wouldn't in the courts in this political fight that we're bracing for.
So you say with just 32 days until the election, you're right, the strategy was now in full view, flood every state, every television news network, every newspaper and news feed with manufactured evidence of fraud to suppress Democratic votes before Election Day and to knock them out of state-by-state tallies in the courts and counting rooms afterward. Go on.
Well, we're really, especially kind of since I finished the piece, things are coming even more into view, and that'll happen in the weeks ahead. What it seems to be we're lining up for, and a lopsided victory by Joe Biden would change this, a lopsided victory by Donald Trump would change this, but we're looking at what seems to be protracted fighting after Election Day, ballot by ballot, state by state. In the swing states, also potentially a state like New York. If New York can't deliver its ballots on time and declare victory, that state does not go officially into a blue column. So until that's done. So there's going to be the state by state, ballot by ballot fight. And the president is driving his argument already through what is now years of argument that there is debilitating, pervasive voter fraud for which there really isn't evidence.
And that's what you're hearing from a lot of concerned Democrats, a lot of concerned election watchers, some election officials who will talk to you on background, that they really want people to go to the polls and vote in person if they are able to, if they feel like they are in a safe enough position to do so, because it just will get counted faster and potentially ward off just the sort of scenario that you're talking about. We'll see what happens, though. Jim Rutenberg. Jim, thank you so much. And really great job reporting. Thank you for bringing that to us.
Who hides evidence? Criminals hide evidence, not honest people. So, over the next 10 days, we get to see the machines that are crooked, the ballots that are fraudulent, and if we're wrong, we will be made fools of. But if we're right, a lot of them will go to jail. So, let's have trial by combat.
All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen by emboldened radical left Democrats, which is what they're doing, and stolen by the fake news media. That's what they've done and what they're doing. We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved. Our country has had enough. We will not take it anymore, and that's what this is all about. And to use a favorite term that all of you people really came up with, we will stop the steal. We have come to demand that Congress do the right thing and only count the electors who have been lawfully slated. I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. Today we will see whether Republicans stand strong for integrity of our elections, but whether or not they stand strong for our country. Our country has been under siege for a long time.
Hold them this way. On January 6th, thousands of rioters, many coming from Trump's Save America rally, stormed the U.S. Capitol as Congress met to certify the 2020 presidential election results. The insurrection resulted in multiple deaths, including an officer, dozens of injuries to law enforcement and rioters, ongoing arrests, and vandalism across the Capitol. Here's how the day unfolded. That morning, thousands gathered at the Ellipse near the White House to hear the president and his allies speak. Shortly before noon, President Trump addressed the crowd.
We will never give up. We will never concede. We're going to walk down to the Capitol because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength and you have to be strong.
Following his speech, the crowd then marched to the U.S. Capitol building, where initially only Capitol Police were stationed. Additional MPD officers would be called to assist by 1 p.m. At 12:53, a large crowd approached approximately 5 Capitol Police officers standing at a fenced-off entrance near the Peace Monument. According to ABC News sources that day, many Capitol Police were armed only with mace and their sidearms. As the crowd pushed the barricades over, the police were quickly overwhelmed. In contrast to other events in D.C. last summer, additional state and federal law enforcement was not pre-staged ahead of the riot. Within minutes, protesters began swarming other entrances of the Capitol, breaking through barricades and continuing to push further toward the building. Inside, Congress began their session with Vice President Pence presiding.
Are there any objections to counting the certificate of vote of the state of Arizona?
I will vote to respect the people's decision and defend our system of government as we know it.
During this time, explosive devices were reported outside the DNC and RNC headquarters. Meanwhile, rioters continued to surround the Capitol, taking photos and waving flags. One video shows rioters streaming past barricades with officers standing by. An audio message from around 2 p.m. warned congressional staffers and reporters to stay away from windows and doors. Between 2 and 2:30, rioters broke through multiple entrances and began pushing further into the building. By 2:30, rioters breached security and made their way into the Capitol through windows and doors. Crowds began pouring into the Rotunda, Crypt, Statuary Hall, and other locations. On the chamber floor, the House recessed and told members to lock down and shelter in place.
They broke the glass? Everybody stay down! Get down!
Around 2:45, members of the Capitol security team barricaded the entry doors to the chamber. Congress members retrieved gas masks from underneath their seats, and tear gas has been released into the Rotunda. Outside the House chamber in a stairwell, protesters attempted to get into a secured hallway. One woman, Ashley Babbitt, was shot by a Capitol policeman and later died. Around 3 p.m., one video shows an officer stuck in a doorway as rioters try to push through. By now, hundreds of rioters occupied the Capitol, roamed the halls, sat at Speaker Pelosi's desk, and vandalized the building. As the insurrection continued, support from more than 18 local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies began to arrive. They tried to dispel the violence using tear gas and flashbangs to move the protesters out of the building. By mid-afternoon, many political leaders and allies of President Trump called on the president to make a statement and denounce the protest.
I tried to call the president immediately, and I've tried a number of different ways to get him.
I call on President Trump to go on national television now to fulfill his oath and defend the Constitution and demand an end to this siege.
At 4:17, more than 2 hours after the violence began, President Trump tweeted a minute-long pre-recorded video speaking directly to the protesters.
You have to go home now. We have to have peace. So go home. We love you.
Earlier in the day, Mayor Bowser implemented a 6 p.m. curfew, and rioters now dispersed. By 8 p.m., senators resumed session in the Senate chamber to confirm the electoral results.
Today was a dark day in the history of the United States Capitol. The violence was quelled. The Capitol is secured, and the people's work continues.
Congress worked through the night, and at 3:39 a.m. certified Joe Biden as the 46th President of the United States.
Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will be the President and the Vice President according to the ballots that have been given to us.
Purpose of the joint session having concluded, pursuant to Senate Concurrent Resolution 1, 117th Congress, the chair declares the joint session dissolved.
Now, the Department of Homeland Security has been warning that white supremacist extremists will remain the most persistent and lethal threat to our country. And January 6th was not the first time we saw a federal building violently attacked with deadly consequences. From the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995 to the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017 to the pipe bomber threats in 2018 to the kidnapping threats against Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer and Virginia Governor Ralph Northam in 2020, and finally that horrific attack on the Capitol in the final days of the Trump presidency. It is clear that violent domestic extremism has stepped out of America's shadows and into our political spotlight. NBC News correspondent Morgan Radford and producer Aaron Franco have been reporting on this issue for years, covering white nationalist candidates running for office to hate groups like the KKK, as well as new extremists on the far left. And you're about to see Morgan's deeper look at what's behind all of it. A bit of a warning here. Some of the video and language may be quite disturbing to some viewers.
The images have become all too familiar. A burst of violence, then fear.
I'm running into harm's way. That's why I have my rifle.
And then chaos.
At least 18 people have been killed.
It's a formula for terror. Public attacks we see, and many we don't.
Preparing to kidnap and possibly kill me.
More than 200 attacks and plots in the past 6 years, spread out over 42 states.
The number of plots and attacks are at the highest level we've ever seen.
I don't know whether we've seen the worst of it. We sure have not seen the last of it.
And while many were from far left and jihadist groups, the vast majority were committed by the far right, nearly 60%. A percentage that surged even higher in the last 6 years.
Right-wing extremism has entered a frightening new phase in this country.
The FBI now calling lone wolf attacks from violent extremists the nation's greatest threat. But are they isolated incidents or part of a bigger trend? To find out, we traveled the country, speaking with experts, militia members, former members of extremist groups, and those who still have ties to them. And one thing became clear. The idea that the Capitol attack was not just possible, but predictable.
Did you know anyone who was there at the January 6th riot?
Yes. I was at parties with these people. I interviewed one of these people into his first hate group.
Samantha knows the face of far-right extremism better than most.
So we're in South Carolina. Is this where you were radicalized?
Mm-hmm. She knows because that face was her own.
I did not think I was racist. I thought that I saw a truth that no one else did.
Were you racist?
Absolutely.
Samantha asks that her last name not be used to protect her safety. She was inducted into a white supremacist group called Identity Europa nearly 4 years ago, after her boyfriend had been radicalized online.
He had started saying some just strange things that I now know are all far-right jokes and slogans. But I confronted him and just point blank was like, what is this? What are all of these phrases? And he had said that he was a fascist and he didn't want to be with someone that didn't support that. I was so desperate for his approval that I ended up choosing to try and understand it, and I fell into the far right.
There, she met some of the most prominent faces of the modern far right, including Richard Spencer and the organizers of the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally.
This is the type of awful tool, propagandistic tool.
They would get books written by or about Jewish people and burn them. And the whole concept behind it was to stop anyone else from having to read Jewish propaganda. But yeah, it was a book burning.
Before splitting apart in 2019, Identity Europa was one of the most active groups in the far right. Their goal? To be mainstream, avoiding recognizable racist images and instead using ambiguous talking points about white identity.
So once you're inside and once you enter this movement, what were the views of the people around you? Did they believe that immigration was okay?
No.
Did they believe that black people were as intelligent as white people?
Absolutely not.
Did they believe in the Holocaust?
You're kind of softballed on all of these topics. And by the end, if all of these things work correctly, then absolutely no immigration. Like the race IQ theory is real. Holocaust absolutely never happened. But Hitler was just a compassionate and empathetic person who just wanted to take care of his people.
Wow.
Dylan Roof, the mass murderer, was a saint. Segregation is an absolute ideal.
I think what's so shocking about this movement in today's day and age is here you are, have your wits about you. How do you end up in this space?
I think part of the reason I decided to speak up was because there are so many high-ranking people in this movement. No one wore hoods, they wore slacks. They were EMTs, they were lawyers, they were doctors, they were your neighbors, they were your family members, still believing in all of this stuff. And I think that is what makes all of this so dangerous and so it's just terrifying. You can't spot the white nationalist anymore.
When Heather Heyer was killed by a white supremacist in Charlottesville, Samantha began to have doubts. 2 months later, her grandmother died, a woman born in Germany and forced to be a member of the Hitler Youth as a child.
How did she feel about you joining the violent alt-right?
She knew exactly what it was as soon as I presented it to her. She called me out and just said, that is Nazism. What you think you're doing is Nazism.
Now, Samantha uses her experience to help others through a project called Future Freedom, an online platform for those on the inside who want to get out.
This is a problem that I think is reaching every living room of every house, every laptop of every computer in the country. And I don't want there to be a world where there are X amount more of me's that went through it and have no idea how they fell for that. No one needs this trauma.
It's a trauma that only appears to be spreading. Extremism experts at the Anti-Defamation League say white supremacist propaganda is now at the highest level ever recorded. And it's reaching people in new ways. One recent study found that between 2005 and 2010, just under 27% of lone wolf extremists were radicalized online in some way. By 2016, that number was more than 73%.
What has changed in the last 20 years is that it has broadened its appeal by, in a sense, reinventing itself around more polite, seemingly innocuous language. What you will see are things like white pride, celebrating European heritage. But if you dig into it, it's the same old racist ideology. It's just been repackaged.
A transformation that sometimes takes a winding road. Chester Doles is running for a county commissioner seat in Lumpkin County, Georgia, about an hour north of Atlanta. He's also fundraising in support of candidates he believes share his values.
I'm running on a MAGA candidate platform. There's a tidal wave of MAGA candidates that are going to rise up in 2022.
What are your top 3 issues?
My top 3 issues would be pro-life, pro-gun, pro-wall.
When he was younger, he was a leader in the Ku Klux Klan and a member of a neo-Nazi group.
Stand back, stand by.
Now, he says that's all in the past.
When did you come out and renounce racism? Because I know you did that in the past.
2019, several times in 2020, but whatever banner I might have been fighting under, the enemy had always been the same. Left-wing radicals, socialistic.
But the Ku Klux Klan isn't against leftist radicals. They're against black people, Jews. What do you believe now that you didn't believe then?
Like I said, it just depends on who's looking at it. When I've ever read anything like that, it seemed like they were just pro-heritage.
The Ku Klux Klan?
But Well, in some forms, but I'm not here to defend them. It was 28 years ago, and I will not spend one more day I did this last year. No more apologies. Get over it.
Publicly disavowed by candidates at the federal level, including Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene and former Senator Kelly Loeffler. He's since thrown his support behind a new slate of candidates, some of them from diverse backgrounds. But many still question whether Doles has changed at all.
I know that you had come out and denounced racism, but when I was looking at social media, you had put this picture here saying that Jovi Val was coming to speak at one of your rallies here. And then this is him, Jovi Val, with the racist, and I mean, this is a Nazi hand gesture. And then he posted here, "Get in, we're hunting Juden." So he's talking about Jews. And that's him at your platform. Do you think that's someone who's a white supremacist?
You know, I wouldn't call him a white supremacist. I think Jovi's got some issues. I didn't know he was quite that extreme.
But that was posted before you invited him. When you invited him and said you were bringing him here, he had already posted those things.
Yeah, well, Jovi was involved a lot with the MAGA. I wasn't aware of any of his other street activism.
But what about, like, on your social media, these are the people following you with swastikas and white power signs. Why are these people attracted to you and your platform?
I don't know. Maybe they're good people, you know, as far as being good American citizens and stuff, but
Can you be a good person, a good American citizen with a swastika and white power?
I don't look into people's personal, you know, what they're all about.
What about this one? I saw you posted just recently this year. You were posting about Valentine's Day stickers and you showed 1488.
Oh, God forbid.
What does that mean?
I don't know.
You don't know what 1488 means?
No.
All that time and in the Klan and reading these white supremacists, 1488 means nothing to you?
Couldn't tell you.
Is it a coincidence that it's a white supremacist?
It must be.
He knows exactly what it means.
Jonathan Greenblatt is an extremism expert with the Anti-Defamation League.
The number 14 refers to what they describe as the 14 words, which is kind of a white supremacist maxim. And 88 refers to the letter H, right? It's the eighth letter of the alphabet. And HH means Heil Hitler.
Doles is no longer a member of the Klan, so is it fair to still label him a white supremacist or an extremist?
ADL's been tracking Doles and other white supremacists for years. And this is something that they do, Morgan. So white supremacists often use this ethos of, quote, plausible deniability. With a wink and a nod, will signal to white supremacists, but look at, let's say, the mainstream media and say, but I'm not one of them anymore.
We have all these different groups, those who are far-right extremists, those who are combating the far-right extremists, and then people who are trying to help de-radicalize young people online. How does this country begin to solve this problem?
There is no silver bullet that will solve the problem of extremism. We actually need not just the full force of government, we need a whole of society strategy if we hope to tackle this.
Tackle a problem that may only be getting worse.
I mean, and some of us will stand to the end to defending American values and family values. I think the enthusiasm that was so overwhelming on January 6th was because people seen it as our last, this is it. Trump's gone, we're done.
Is that what you think?
Yeah.
What do you think those rioters thought they were doing?
I think they all thought that they were revolutionaries, that they were going to bring justice and the truth out to the country. I know what that feels like. I felt that too.
You thought you were the last stand of
the Western civilization.
A civilization that some are afraid will leave them behind.
And Morgan Radford joins me now, along with former special agent for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosive, Jim Kavanaugh, who helped investigate and sometimes negotiate with some of the most infamous violent domestic extremists in this country over the span of more than 3 decades. Morgan, a tremendous piece. In some ways, there's a lot to unpack here, but I just want to start with your first character in your piece, Samantha. Is she going to, you know, when you join this and she's left it, how much of this past of hers is still haunting her?
I think it still haunts her. You heard her say no one deserves this trauma. I mean, she acknowledges that this was an incredibly difficult portion of her life, but that's why she's worked so hard to help de-radicalize people. And one of the things Samantha really taught us is that a lot of these people, Chuck, are attracted to this extremist ideology because it's personal. It gives them a place to feel like they belong. And she speaks very openly about how when these people are going online and they're searching for answers, or ultimately they're searching for connection, they're finding that these far-right, often extremist groups are there with open arms, and that's how they're getting caught.
Samantha, Morgan, did you get a sense that Samantha, there was a time where she felt good about what she was doing because she had this community?
Absolutely. She's very honest about that. She says that initially part of what attracted her to this movement was because they told her that she was okay just the way that she was. And she says she liked their approach to femininity, that they said that you can be a traditional woman and hold traditional values and have a traditional role, and that is okay. So don't pay attention to what society tells you about that not being okay, because we are here to assure you that who you are and what we collectively are doing is right. And so she said that's initially what attracted her. But then, obviously, she came to a point where she said, this is absolutely wrong, because how can I be in this space that says I'm okay, but all of these other groups of people are not?
And Morgan, there was something about Chester Doles that looked awfully familiar to any of us that have followed or reported on white supremacy and all this. He sort of, you hate to say that, you hate to put it this way, but he kind of looked the part here, and he's not happy with the reporting we've been doing. You've been hearing from him.
And I think one thing to point out, Chuck, is that I honestly don't think that when it comes to this extremist movement, there is such a thing right now as looking the part. Because one of the things that you understand is that, as Samantha said, that a lot of people, they don't have hoods, right? They have slacks, they have signals and haircuts, and they've made this movement seemingly very innocuous. And that's how it's infiltrated politics, right? From the highest levels. And so with Chester, for example, I mean, what you hear is this belief that people on the far right believe that they are the last stand of Western civilization. He told me very clearly that he felt the 1950s were a more wholesome time. When I pointed out that that wasn't a more wholesome time for my family and people who looked like me, he said, well, that happens, but for him, he felt like it was. And even in anticipation of this interview airing, I have to say Chester Doles sent a text message to my producer, Aaron Franco, and he wrote that I was a Marxist reporter, I was a dangerous mouthpiece of the Biden administration, and that, quote, if Trump comes back, she will be remembered. She is definitely the enemy in our eyes. And what you understand from that, Chuck, is anyone who reports on this knows that that is not even a thinly veiled threat, because what he talked about in our interview was the day of the rope. It is based on this maxim within white supremacist ideology that there will come a day when journalists and politicians and people who are others, people who they don't like, people of color, people who are homosexual, will be hung. They will be executed on the day of the rope. And so he's making a clear connection to the fact that when he believes Trump comes in office, he will have a guy. He will have someone who believes, according to him, in the values that he espouses, and that people like me who bring his feelings to light will be in trouble.
Jim, in your experience, how many Chesters are in this movement and how many Samanthas are in this movement? The reason I say this is, how many people can be rescued like Samantha, and how many people are probably beyond rescuing like Chester?
Well, unfortunately, there's a lot of Chesters who try to hide their white supremacy beliefs and use code words and try to talk around it and be the new alt-right. But there's always a lot of people like Samantha, and you can see the contrast here. Samantha is a person, as Morgan described in this great report, who was radicalized but realized what it was and got out, and truly got out and renounced it, and now has a chance for a normal life to become a good citizen. And where Chester is still embracing it, apparently, using 1488, the 14 words from Robert Matthews of the Order, about securing a future for white children, and 88, which is the symbol for Heil Hitler. So that's not renouncing anything. That's still being a member of that belief. And the day of the rope That's from the Turner Diaries, which is a white supremacist screed written by a National Alliance leader named William Pierce. That was the book that Timothy McVeigh acted upon in his bombing of the Oklahoma City Federal Building, the Turner Diaries. That's a screed that is in white supremacist circles. So he's quoting from, in his communique with Morgan, the Turner Diaries and the Day of the Rope. And that's why they want to hang all their enemies, all their enemies, which they hate, black people, Jewish people, brown people, Catholics, government officials, everybody but them. And, that they deeply held beliefs. So we have a huge problem in America, and it's unbelievable that we've come to it. Mm-hmm.
I want to get to the issue of, we saw the last person there, the gentleman, Grandmaster Jay, that started what he believes is essentially, I guess, an answer to this. But he views it, hey, look, violence, it's a last resort, but it is a resort. Jim, is this just an inevitable response to this right-wing violence?
Well, it's happened before. I mean, we've had clashes with the Communist Party and the Klan. 42 years ago in Greensboro, North Carolina, 1979, the Communist Party members were holding a Death to the Klan rally, and Klansmen and neo-Nazis arrived. They killed 5 of the protesters from the Communist Party and wounded another 10 in a big shootout on the street. These are 2 opposing groups clashing. So, that could certainly come to pass. This NFAC coalition is like a militia, but they have not been, they have individual members who may have been involved in crimes. I think the leader has some charges pending, but they haven't as a unit committed any grave crimes. But what we've seen across the country is that we've loosened these gun laws so much that we have these militiamen in Michigan standing at the Capitol with rifles. We have everybody showing up at demonstrations, slung with their bandoleros and rifles. And eventually you're going to have opposing groups, and, you might have the police in the middle. It's a scenario that's really just a recipe for disaster. And eventually, we're going to have to face it.
That's what it feels like. Morgan Radford, terrific reporting. Jim Kavanaugh, as always, your expertise and context in all this is quite important. Really appreciate the time you gave me on our podcast, too, and I encourage folks, listen to our podcast. Jim's got a lot more to say on this. Thank you both. When we come back, democracy is ours, if we can keep it. Welcome back. This year, we've seen the United States Capitol attacked not once, but twice. And even in a city that's used to lockdowns and national security warnings, this moment in time feels different. Tensions are high, and politicians sadly seem eager to join the grievance chorus rather than try to find solutions to our problems. The country is more divided against itself than at any time since the 1960s, and maybe before that. The extremism and violence on the right is only one symptom. Politicians are always telling us there's more that unites us than divides us. That may still be true, but the divisions are easier to see right now. But like most things in history, periods like this are cyclical. And so our democratic experiment in self-governance has weathered tests before. Tests like the one we are in the middle of right now. During the Civil War, our better angels eventually, as Lincoln said, prevailed. After the Gilded Age, our leaders responded to inequity by lifting some of the forgotten out of poverty. During McCarthyism, we pulled ourselves back from the brink. And again in the civil rights era, the federal government stepped in to try to right our collective wrongs. This current test is not yet over. We don't know if we will get a passing grade. This great experiment of democracy is still that, an experiment. And sadly, as we know, many experiments do fail. This patchwork, multiracial, multi-ethnic, melting pot of a democratic republic is ours for now, if we can keep it.